Can you use sample dots to make an entire illustration? Let's find out. Hello and welcome back. I hope that you're doing well. Today I'm using the Da Vinci sample set of watercolours that I picked up a couple months ago. It's been a bit since I've been able to get around to doing an illustration with them, but I'll put on screen the colours that I'm going to be using today. I'm using 6 total as far as I remember. And I mainly decided to use colours that I usually go for and then add in a couple that were new to me and trying to prioritise ones that I don't normally come across. So I picked out the earth tones and the ultramarine because that's typically what I go for when I'm painting big cats from Africa. So your lions, your cheetah and African leopards. And I tend to go for a mixture of yellow ochre, burnt sienna, burnt umber, and ultramarine for painting the big cat itself. And then obviously I'll mix in something to create some other brighter greens for adding in backgrounds. But for this, I decided to go for using the Denise's green, and I also added in another earth tone, which is brown madder quin. Both of these are slightly interesting because they're convenience mixes. So the brown madder quin I added because I've never really come across an earth tone, especially a convenience earth tone, that contains PV19 before, so that really interested me coming across it. When I was doing the swatching video, I think I actually said that I would never use this colour when I was swatching it out, and then funnily enough when it came to doing this illustration I was like, I want to try this and see what happens, and I ended up really liking it. So I'll mention when I bring that in and why I brought it in once I start painting. But yeah, it was an odd colour, but I'm glad that I ended up using it. So actually right here is when I used it. It's the very first pigment I put on the page. I used it for the slightly redder earth tones, the reddish and almost pinkish earth tones that you see on, say, like the nose here, but also on the teardrop shapes on lions. You can get a much more redder tone on some lions, and then on some other lions it'll be a slightly more rusty orangey kind of tone. And that was pretty much entirely where I used it, other than for slightly shifting some of the later fur tones in, I'd probably say, the final few layers of the fur. And I'm not sure if I used it at all in the background, but I did enjoy using it, funnily enough, even though I thought I would never pick a colour like this. It's PR 101 mixed with PP19, and I don't always have a PR 101 on my palette. I typically really like having my PBR 7 earth tones when it comes to like the burnt category, so like your burnt umber, burnt sienna. I like PBR 7 for its characteristics, but I do occasionally like using PR 101s, but I like to have them in addition to my PBR 7s. So maybe I'm starting to enter into a thing now where I might end up wanting to have a PR 101 on my palette, but we'll see. We'll see. For now, I'm happy with, I do normally use, I think it's PBR 25. I always forget if it's 25 or 23, but that's my typical transparent red brown. And I think it's literally called brown red or red brown. That's my typical go-to on my palette, and that brown madder quin essentially filled the spot, but it definitely had a different hue to it than the brown red brown that I normally use. Right now in the illustration, I am trying to get my undertones established and get some colour on the paper. That's always an important thing to do in my process, is start getting some light colour down, knock out the white of the paper on the area that I'm primarily working in, which is right now the lioness herself, and I'm focusing on establishing the warm undertones right now. I know that I wanted to, hang on, let me word this. I knew at the time that I wanted to light her from the left and have the right, in our perspective, in shadow. I was deciding at the time how I wanted to do this, and I decided that in order to have like a unifying element, that I would have all of her have some warm undertones, and then I'd go in and establish the cool half and the warm half, and then there's still that underlying element that brings both of them together. And I'm pretty happy with the result of that. It meant that I used quite a lot of ultramarine on the right side, which you'll see a little bit later. I kind of left that until I'd gone through a few of the layering processes, because in part I didn't want to end up disturbing the ultramarine too much, because in my time painting with ultramarine, I know that it's pretty easy to lift, and I didn't want to disturb any of the granulation by doing too many layers on the right side. I'm starting to add in texture now, a little bit, but still have it quite washed out and soft. Is not washed out, soft. Trying to have it quite soft, because I'm going to go in with a couple more layers on top of what you're seeing and kind of build a little bit of texture in the fur. This is something that I've been playing around with throughout each big cat that I paint, and also other animals as well, but I have been on a very long, at this point, big cat binge with painting and drawing. And I've also been painting and drawing bears as well, and I do really want to get into doing some more bear illustrations, especially as we're heading into autumn. I do tend to associate bears with autumn, so that could be on the horizon, maybe. I do still have loads of reference photos from when I went to the wildlife park with the polar bears. I've got loads of them swimming and diving in the big lake that they had, and I might revisit those and do some sketches and things to figure out if I want to do something with them or if I want to do something with black bears, brown bears, we'll see. But back to the lioness. I started off with my yellow ochres and my yellow ochre and raw sienna. The two yellow earth tones is what I started with, and then knocked them back with either burnt umber, burnt sienna, or a little tiny bit of ultramarine if I didn't want them to be too in-your-face yellow. They're not very in-your-face yellows to begin with, but sometimes when you're using them with a lot of earth tones, you might want to knock back certain earth tones because they can end up appearing too vivid. So I was mindful of that. I typically am mindful of that with burnt sienna and yellow ochre, more so than other colours, because those can end up becoming quite vibrant depending on the other colours you're using. So those I was knocking back a little bit here and there, and you're starting to see me bring in more of the burnt sienna into the mix now. I tended to leave the burnt umber for either knocking back colours or for the later stages of the fur. So when I started to do the second and third layers of areas you're seeing at the moment. To develop all of the texture, I was pretty much using the same method everywhere, and that was to place down blobs of colour and to make those blobs interesting shapes, and also to make sure that there was interesting negative shapes or gaps between them, and then to really clean my brush thoroughly and then put some clean water on the brush and go in and soften the edges and also connect shapes together, but making sure to leave some interesting hard edges as well as soft edges, and also making sure that there's some nice gaps or negative space between the colours shapes as well. And that was pretty much what I was using to establish each layer of the fur textures, and it's something that I've been experimenting with the last few months. It's been a method that I've been trying to get better and better at, and for using for all sorts of different textures. And so far I'm really enjoying the results I'm getting from it, and I want to keep getting better and better at it. Now you're seeing me establish what I would like to probably call the holding my breath layer. I made a really big puddle of ultramarine blue. I was using the ultramarine in the set that was just called ultramarine blue because there was at least 3, maybe 4 ultramarines on the palette, and I just went with the standard. And I then mixed that with a little bit of either burnt sienna or burnt umber. I can't remember which one. I think it was burnt umber. And then that was just to really knock back it being too blue, but I still wanted it to be cool. And then I went in and painted 1 layer of ultramarine. This was difficult because I was trying to do it all in 1 layer and establish not just the areas of shadow, but also important key areas that I wanted to have with hard edges, such as the cast shadow by the ear on the left, or soft edges, for example, on the other ear. And I had to try and work that layer while it was still wet and try and make sure I knew what I was doing when it came to the edges on the fly, pretty much. So I did plan in advance in my head what I was going to do before I acted, just so that I wasn't flailing around in the moment. But it is still a hold your breath moment when you're doing a really big wash like that. And from then on, it was pretty much just a case of keeping on building up the texture and establishing some more of the details, as well as eventually the whiskers too, and of course the background. At this point, I was noticing that I was using up quite a bit of the ultramarine, but it held for the majority of what I needed it to do. And it did turn out that I had enough ultramarine, more than enough ultramarine to finish this. And I had more than enough of the earth tones as well from doing this illustration. Probably enough that I could maybe squeeze like a 5x7 illustration out of the earth tones I used, especially the yellow ochre. I did go quite heavy on the burnt sienna, looking back at the paint blobs, but I definitely went heavy on the ultramarine usage, so that one is probably gonna need a little bit of help if I went for an illustration that required a fair bit of ultramarine. I do get through ultramarine quite quickly. It's one of my fastest colours, arguably the fastest colour that I get through in watercolour. So I wasn't too surprised with how much I used of the paint blob. I'm just happy that I managed to finish the illustration without using all of it up. At the end of the process, I'll actually show what the paint blobs look like as well, so you can see how much of the paint I did end up using. And it was surprisingly not that much for some of them, but you can definitely see the dent in the ultramarine. I enjoyed using all of the colours I used. The earth tones acted like how I want the earth tones of their name to act. So I like using yellow ochres that are PY42 or PY43. I do generally prefer them to be semi-transparent, semi-opaque leaning rather than fully opaque. I did enjoy using this one. I'd like to actually compare it to the yellow ochres that I currently use. So the 2 that I currently have are my Daniel Smith and Isaro. Both of those are very different. So I would like to see where the Da Vinci yellow ochre lies between those 2. I have a feeling it's probably going to quite literally be between those 2 in terms of its hue and properties, but definitely enjoyed that one. The raw sienna I also really enjoyed using. I don't reach for raw sienna that often in watercolour. I don't think I actually own it in watercolour, in terms of having like an actual tube of it or a pan of it, but I have played around with raw sienna before, and I do use raw sienna in oil painting of all things. So I do have some experience with the hue of raw sienna. I do feel like I reached for it enough to warrant the need for it with this particular portrait. I didn't feel like just mixing yellow ochre with some of the other earth tones could have filled its place. In theory it can. You can mix a lot of colours yourself, but I did end up actually using the raw sienna without feeling like, oh, I'll just try and mix something similar myself. I really enjoyed the burnt sienna. It's very, very much a kind of burnt sienna I enjoy in terms of its opacity and its hue. I also enjoyed its level of granulation. I loved how it played with other colours, such as with the ultramarine, especially the ultramarine, because burnt sienna and ultramarine go hand in hand with a lot of traditional painting mediums, and it is a combination that I do use a lot in painting. So that was something that I was trying to test through this illustration, was the burnt sienna and its relationship with ultramarine, because I do use those two together quite a lot. Just like burnt umber, I like to use burnt umber with ultramarine quite a lot. You get a very different grey and very different browns and neutrals from using burnt umber with ultramarine versus using burnt sienna. So I wanted to test that as well. I do have a tube of the burnt umber, and this was, using these dots, my first chance to actually use the paint. So I'm very excited that I have the tube of it now, because I really enjoyed painting with it. So I'm glad that I have that to replace my used up burnt umber. This is the resulting ultramarine. You can see quite a dent in it, but thank you for joining along with this with me, and I will see you next time. Bye!